The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany walls of Pinewood Country Club's main dining room as I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching my worn canvas tote bag while 200 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me with barely concealed disgust. My second-hand dress, carefully selected from a thrift store that morning, suddenly felt like a costume in a play I never auditioned for. The silence stretched until Victoria Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a blade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Excuse me, but I think you're lost, she said, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a champagne flute as she looked me up and down with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant, stuck to the bottom of a designer shoe. The service entrance is around back. Her husband Richard laughed, a sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and seemed to encourage the other members to join in their amusement. Honey, I don't think she's here to work. Look at those shoes. He pointed at my scuffed sneakers with theatrical horror. I think someone actually believes they belong here. The laughter grew louder, more confident, as if my presence had provided them with the evening's entertainment. Amanda Foster, draped in pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars, leaned toward her companion and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "How did security even let her in? This is supposed to be a private member event." Standing there in that opulent dining room, surrounded by the kind of wealth that spoke in whispers and commanded respect through intimidation, I felt something cold and calculating settle into my chest. These people had no idea who they were mocking, no concept of the power they were so casually dismissing. What they saw was Emma Chen, a 28-year-old woman in discount clothing who had somehow wandered into their exclusive world. What they couldn't see was the empire I had built in the shadows, the fortune I had accumulated through careful investment and strategic planning, or the fact that the very ground they stood on belonged to me. The evening had started so differently just 2 hours earlier. I had been sitting in my modest apartment on Elm Street, reviewing financial reports from my property management company, when Grace Thompson called with an invitation that would change everything. Grace had been my first employee when I started Chen Holdings 5 years ago, though she now worked as an event coordinator for various social organizations around Springfield. Her voice carried an excitement that immediately put me on alert. "Emma, you have to come to the Pinewood Country Club tonight," she said without preamble. "They're having their annual charity auction, and I managed to get you on the guest list. It's the perfect opportunity to network with the city's power players." I had hesitated, knowing that my usual approach to business involved staying behind the scenes, letting my lawyers and property managers handle the public-facing aspects of my real estate empire. Most people in Springfield knew Chen Holdings as a successful property development company, but few connected it to the quiet young woman who preferred jeans and sneakers to designer suits and high heels. "Grace, you know I'm not really the social event type," I had replied, already knowing she wouldn't accept that as an answer. "Emma, you own half the commercial real estate in this city, but nobody knows your face. Don't you think it's time to step out of the shadows? Besides, the money they raise tonight goes to the homeless shelter downtown. It's a good cause." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been anonymously funding that homeless shelter for 3 years, contributing more than all the country club members combined. Yet I would be walking into their event as an outsider looking for acceptance from people who had never earned what they so casually displayed. "Fine," I had said finally. "But I'm not dressing up like them. If they want to meet the real Emma Chen, they'll get the real Emma Chen." That decision had led me to this moment, standing in the doorway of Pinewood Country Club's dining room, while Richard Blackwood continued his performance for the amusement of his social circle. "Seriously though," he was saying, gesturing toward me with his whiskey glass, "this is exactly why we need better security protocols. We can't have random people wandering in off the street just because they saw lights and thought there might be free food." The cruelty in his voice was casual, practiced, as if diminishing others was simply part of his evening routine. I watched as several other members nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the kind of superiority that comes from inherited wealth and unexamined privilege. David Park, the club manager, appeared at my elbow with the nervous energy of someone trying to prevent a scene. "Miss, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private member event, and we weren't notified of any additional guests." Actually, I said quietly, reaching into my tote bag to retrieve the invitation Grace had arranged. I am on the guest list. Emma Chen, +1. David took the invitation with trembling fingers, his face growing pale as he read the official letterhead and verified the authenticity of the document. The room had grown quiet again, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. This appears to be legitimate, David said finally, though his voice carried the reluctance of someone delivering news he didn't want to believe. Victoria Blackwood's champagne flute paused halfway to her lips. Chen? She repeated, as if the name left a bad taste in her mouth. As in Chen Holdings? The recognition in her voice sent a ripple of interest through the gathered crowd. Chen Holdings had been making headlines in Springfield's business community for its aggressive acquisition of commercial properties and its mysterious owner, who never appeared at public events or gave interviews to the local business journal. Yes, I replied simply, not elaborating or explaining myself to people who had already demonstrated their character so clearly. Richard Blackwood's expression shifted from amusement to curiosity, though the underlying disdain remained. You're telling us that you're connected to Chen Holdings? The real estate company? I am Chen Holdings, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room with perfect clarity. The laughter that erupted was even louder than before, fueled by disbelief and the kind of aggressive certainty that comes from never being challenged. Amanda Foster actually had to set down her wine glass to avoid spilling it as she doubled over with mirth. Oh, this is rich, she gasped, between laughs. The cleaning lady thinks she owns a real estate empire. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're secretly a millionaire? Michael Hayes, a board member whose family had belonged to Pinewood for 3 generations, shook his head with the patience of someone explaining reality to a child. Honey, Chen Holdings is worth probably $50 million. The owner doesn't shop at thrift stores and carry a canvas bag from the grocery store. Their assumptions were so complete, so unshakable, that I found myself genuinely curious about how they would react when reality finally penetrated their carefully constructed worldview. These people had built their identities around exclusion, around the belief that wealth and status were visible, measurable qualities that could be determined by clothing, accessories, and social connections. You're right, I said, nodding thoughtfully. The owner of Chen Holdings wouldn't normally dress this way for a social event. The validation seemed to satisfy them, and the conversation began to shift away from my presence toward more familiar topics of gossip and social positioning. But I wasn't finished speaking. However, I continued, my voice cutting through their renewed chatter, sometimes the owner of Chen Holdings likes to see how people treat others when they think no one important is watching. The silence that fell this time was different, charged with uncertainty, and the first hint that perhaps their assumptions weren't as solid as they had believed. Victoria Blackwood's eyes narrowed as she studied my face more carefully, looking for something she might have missed in her initial assessment. You're serious, she said slowly, though her voice still carried doubt. Completely serious, I confirmed. And what I've seen tonight has been quite educational. Grace Thompson chose that moment to appear at the dining room entrance, her professional smile faltering as she took in the tense atmosphere and my position at the center of what was clearly a confrontation. She moved toward me with the quick steps of someone trying to prevent a disaster. Emma, she said breathlessly, I'm so sorry I'm late. The parking situation was impossible. I see you've already introduced yourself to everyone. Her use of my first name, spoken with familiar warmth, seemed to carry more weight than my own claims about my identity. Grace had worked with these people on various charity events, and her acknowledgement of me as someone worth knowing created a crack in their certainty. Grace, Richard Blackwood said carefully, you know this person? Know her. Grace laughed, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as she tried to navigate the social minefield she had walked into. Emma is my former boss and one of the most successful business owners in Springfield. She's the one who suggested I apply for the coordinator position with the Historical Society. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as the implications began to sink in. If Grace Thompson, who had organized events for half the social organizations in the city, was claiming that I was not only legitimate but successful, then their treatment of me had been a spectacular miscalculation. David Park appeared to be having some kind of internal crisis, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, embarrassment, and dawning horror, as he realized he had just attempted to eject someone who might actually belong at the event more than some of the people who had been mocking me. "Miss Chen," he said nervously, "perhaps we could start over. I'm David Park, the club manager. Welcome to Pinewood Country Club." "Thank you, David," I replied graciously, as if the previous 10 minutes hadn't happened. "It's a beautiful facility. I can see why membership is so exclusive." The word exclusive hung in the air with implications that were just beginning to dawn on the assembled crowd. If I was who I claimed to be, then I wasn't someone seeking their acceptance or approval. I was someone who could afford to buy and sell most of them several times over. Someone who had chosen to present myself modestly while they had chosen to reveal their character completely. Victoria Blackwood was the first to attempt damage control, her champagne flute abandoned as she moved toward me with a smile that probably cost as much to maintain as a luxury car payment. "Miss Chen, I think there may have been some confusion. When you first arrived, we thought you might be lost, and we were simply trying to be helpful. You know how these large events can be disorienting." The rewriting of history was so blatant, so shameless that I almost admired the audacity. In the span of 30 seconds, she had transformed mocking laughter into helpful concern, cruelty into confusion, and deliberate humiliation into innocent misunderstanding. "How thoughtful," I said, my tone neutral enough to avoid giving her any ammunition, while making it clear that I wasn't buying her revision of events. Richard Blackwood, perhaps sensing that his wife's approach wasn't going to work, decided to try a different strategy. He extended his hand toward me with the confident smile of someone who had never met a social situation he couldn't charm his way through. "Richard Blackwood," he said, as if we were meeting for the first time. "I'm on the club's board of directors. We're always pleased to meet successful business leaders in our community." I looked at his extended hand for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The entire room was watching our interaction, waiting to see how I would respond to his attempt at reconciliation. "Interesting," I said finally, without taking his hand. 5 minutes ago you were concerned about security protocols and random people wandering in off the street. Now you're pleased to meet community leaders. That's quite a range of emotions for one evening." His hand slowly dropped to his side, and I saw the first crack in his confident facade. These people were used to being forgiven for their behavior, accustomed to having their wealth and status serve as automatic absolution for whatever cruelty they deemed necessary to maintain their social hierarchy. "I think you..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Misunderstood," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried when he was performing for his audience. "We were simply trying to maintain the appropriate atmosphere for our charity event." "The appropriate atmosphere," I repeated thoughtfully. "You mean the atmosphere where people judge others based on their clothing and attempt to humiliate them in front of a crowd?" Amanda Foster, who had been notably quiet since Grace's arrival, finally found her voice. "Miss Chen, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. These events can be quite formal, and we weren't sure about the dress code expectations." The excuse was so weak that it barely qualified as an attempt, but I could see the desperation behind it. These people were beginning to realize that they had publicly attacked someone who might have the power to make their lives significantly more difficult. "The dress code," I said, looking around the room at the sea of designer gowns and expensive suits. "Yes, I can see how important that is to everyone here." I paused, letting my gaze settle on each of the people who had participated in my humiliation, watching as they shifted uncomfortably under scrutiny they weren't accustomed to receiving. "You know what's interesting about dress codes?" I continued. "They're usually designed to maintain standards and show respect for the occasion. But I'm curious about what standards you were trying to maintain when you assumed I was here to steal food or provide cleaning services." The question hung in the air like an accusation, which it was. David Park looked like he was contemplating whether it was possible to die from embarrassment, while several other club members had suddenly discovered fascinating details in their drinks that required intense concentration. Grace touched my arm gently, a gesture that I recognized as her diplomatic way of suggesting that perhaps I had made my point and could now allow the evening to move forward. She had always been skilled at reading social situations and finding ways to de-escalate tension while preserving everyone's dignity. "Emma," she said quietly, "why don't I show you around the club? The auction preview is set up in the East Wing, and there are some beautiful pieces being donated this year." The suggestion offered everyone an escape route from a conversation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the people who had initiated it. I could graciously accept the tour, allow them to pretend that the last 15 minutes had been an unfortunate misunderstanding, and move forward with the evening's festivities. Instead, I smiled at Grace with genuine warmth while addressing the room in a voice that carried clearly to every corner. "That's very kind of you, Grace, but I think I'd like to stay here for a few more minutes. You see, I'm finding this conversation quite educational. It's not often that I get to observe how the members of Pinewood Country Club treat people they perceive as inferior." The word inferior landed like a physical blow, stripping away any pretense that this was a simple misunderstanding or social awkwardness. I had just accused them, publicly and directly, of the exact behavior they had displayed, removing their ability to hide behind euphemisms or rewritten history. Michael Hayes, whose family legacy at the club apparently gave him some sense of authority, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the voice of reason in difficult situations. "Miss Chen, I think we can all agree that there have been some unfortunate miscommunications this evening. Perhaps we could start fresh and focus on the charitable purpose that brought us all together." "Miscommunications," I repeated, as if considering the word carefully. "Is that what we're calling it when your wife pointed at my shoes and suggested I didn't belong here?" His face went pale as he realized I had been paying attention to more than just the main players in this drama. The casual cruelty had been so pervasive, so automatic, that they probably hadn't even realized how many people had participated in my public humiliation. "I think," I continued, "that what happened here tonight was exactly the communication you intended. You saw someone who didn't meet your visual standards for wealth and status, and you decided to entertain yourselves at her expense." The accuracy of my assessment was written across their faces in expressions of shame, anger, and desperate calculation. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't going to be resolved with apologies and social pleasantries, that I wasn't someone who could be dismissed or intimidated into accepting their version of events. Victoria Blackwood, perhaps sensing that her husband's diplomatic approach was failing, decided to try a more direct strategy. "Miss Chen, if you are indeed the owner of Chen Holdings, then surely you understand the importance of maintaining certain standards in exclusive establishments. Pinewood Country Club has been serving Springfield's finest families for over 70 years. Springfield's finest families, I said, letting the phrase roll off my tongue as if tasting something unpleasant. And what exactly makes a family fine, Mrs. Blackwood? Is it their ability to humiliate strangers, their skill at judging people by their clothing, or perhaps their talent for rewriting history when their behavior becomes inconvenient?" Her mouth opened and closed without sound, like someone trying to argue with an accusation that was too accurate to deny. The other members were watching our exchange with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. "Because if those are the standards that make a family fine," I continued, "then I think Springfield might benefit from some new definitions." Grace was tugging at my arm more insistently now, clearly recognizing that I was approaching a point of no return in this confrontation. But I had spent 5 years building my business while remaining invisible, allowing people like these to shape Springfield's social and economic landscape without challenge or accountability. "Emma," Grace whispered urgently, "maybe we should look at the auction items now." "Actually," I said, reaching into my tote bag again, "I think I'd like to make a donation to tonight's auction." The shift in topic seemed to confuse everyone, including Grace, who had been expecting me to either explode or retreat. Instead, I pulled out my checkbook, a simple black leather folder that looked completely ordinary until I opened it to reveal checks from First National Bank's Private Wealth Management Division. "What charity are we supporting tonight?" I asked David Park, who was staring at my checkbook with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex mathematical equation. The Springfield Homeless Shelter," he said slowly. "All proceeds from tonight's auction will go toward expanding their facilities and programs." "Wonderful," I said, beginning to write with careful, deliberate strokes. "I've been looking for a way to increase my support for their work." The scratch of my pen against paper was the only sound in the room as I filled out a check for $50,000, an amount that would likely exceed the total raised by their entire auction. When I finished writing, I tore the check from the book with a crisp sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "There," I said, holding the check toward David Park. "My contribution to tonight's fundraising efforts." He took the check with trembling fingers, his eyes widening as he read the amount. The number seemed to short-circuit his ability to process what was happening, and he stared at the paper as if it might disappear if he blinked. $50,000, he said weakly, though whether he was confirming the amount or expressing disbelief was unclear. "Is that not enough?" I asked with innocent concern. "I could certainly write another check if the shelter needs additional support." The offer sent a visible shudder through the assembled crowd. $50,000 was already more than most of them had ever donated to any cause, and the casual way I offered to double it suggested resources that dwarfed their own. Richard Blackwood was staring at me with the expression of someone recalculating everything he thought he knew about the evening's events. If I could write checks for $50,000 without blinking, then I wasn't just successful. I was operating in a different economic stratosphere entirely. "Miss Chen," he said carefully, "that's incredibly generous. The shelter will be able to expand their program significantly with this kind of support." "I hope so," I replied. "I've been funding their operations anonymously for several years now, but I thought tonight might be a good opportunity to be more public about my charitable commitments." The revelation that I had been secretly supporting the very charity they were supposedly raising money for added another layer of irony to the evening's events. While they had been playing dress-up and congratulating themselves for their generosity, I had been actually solving the problems they claimed to care about. Amanda Foster, who had been notably quiet since my identity became clear, finally found her voice again. "You've been funding the homeless shelter?" she asked, as if the concept was too complex to fully grasp. "Among other things," I said casually. "I believe in supporting causes that make a real difference in our community, especially for people who don't have the advantages that many of us take for granted." The emphasis on advantages was deliberate, a reminder that their wealth and status hadn't been earned through any particular merit, but were simply accidents of birth and circumstance that they had chosen to use as weapons against people they perceived as lesser. Grace was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of pride and concern that suggested she was beginning to understand exactly what kind of confrontation she had inadvertently orchestrated by bringing me to this event. "Emma," she said quietly, "maybe we should get some air." "That's a good idea," I agreed, though not for the reason she was suggesting. "I think I'd like to take a walk around the grounds and see more of this beautiful facility." The suggestion sent a wave of anxiety through the gathered crowd, though I wasn't sure why until I saw David Park's face go even paler than before. "The grounds," he repeated nervously. "Yes, of course, though I should mention that some areas are currently under renovation." "Renovation?" I asked with interest. "What kind of renovation work are you having done?" His discomfort was so obvious that even the socially oblivious members of his audience were beginning to notice something was wrong. He shifted from foot to foot, glancing toward the windows that overlooked the golf course as if seeking escape. "Just some, facility updates," he said vaguely. Nothing that would interest our guests, but I was very interested, particularly in the way he was avoiding my questions and the nervous energy that seemed to be radiating from his entire body. In my experience, people only acted this uncomfortable when they were hiding something significant. "Well," I said brightly, "I'm sure whatever improvements you're making will only add to the club's already impressive reputation." The words were innocent enough, but something in my tone seemed to suggest that I knew more than I was saying. David Park's face was now approaching a shade of gray that suggested either illness or terror, and several of the members were beginning to exchange concerned glances. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed as they stood in their expensive clothes making small talk about charity and community, was that I had spent the last 6 months investigating every aspect of Pinewood Country Club's operations, not out of any desire to join their exclusive world, but because I had been systematically acquiring the commercial real estate that surrounded their precious facility. The land their parking lot sat on? Mine. The shopping center, where their members went for their post-golf lunches? Mine. The office buildings that housed their lawyers and accountants? Mine. And most significantly, the plot of land that their clubhouse had been built on 70 years ago, Land that had been leased from a development company that had changed hands 6 times since the original agreement was signed? That was mine too. And tomorrow morning their lease was coming up for renewal. The ride home from Pinewood Country Club passed in contemplative silence as Grace drove through the winding streets of Riverside Heights, occasionally glancing at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The evening's events had clearly shaken her understanding of who I was and what I was capable of, though she had only witnessed the opening act of what I was beginning to realize would be a much larger production. "Emma," she said finally as we pulled into the parking lot of my modest apartment complex on Elm Street, "what exactly are you planning?" I gathered my canvas tote bag and considered her question carefully. Grace had been loyal to me for years, first as an employee and then as a friend. But what I was contemplating would require a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond anything she had experienced in her event planning career. "I'm planning to give the members of Pinewood Country Club exactly what they deserve," I said simply, which is a lesson in the difference between appearance and reality. She shook her head with the frustrated affection of someone who had learned to recognize when I was being deliberately obtuse. "Emma, I've seen you negotiate million-dollar real estate deals with the same emotional investment most people bring to buying groceries. Tonight you looked like you wanted to burn that place to the ground." She wasn't wrong. The casual cruelty I had witnessed at Pinewood had awakened something in me that went beyond business strategy or financial calculation. These people had revealed their character so completely, so confidently, that they deserved to understand exactly what their arrogance had cost them. "Maybe I do want to burn it down," I said, stepping out of her car. "Metaphorically speaking, of course." "Of course," Grace repeated, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced about the metaphorical part. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, a deliberately modest space that served as perfect camouflage for someone who preferred to keep her wealth invisible. The furnishings were comfortable but unremarkable, chosen more for function than display, and the only hint of my true financial situation was the state-of-the-art computer system I used to manage my business operations. The irony of my living situation wasn't lost on me. I owned a penthouse apartment in Springfield's most exclusive high-rise, a mountain retreat in Aspen, and a beach house in the Outer Banks. But I chose to spend most of my time in a place that cost less per month than some people spent on their car payments. It kept me grounded, reminded me where I had come from, and provided the perfect cover for someone who needed to move through the world without drawing attention. But tonight had changed the equation. Tonight, the members of Pinewood Country Club had forced me out of the shadows through their own stupidity and arrogance, and now I had to decide what to do with the visibility they had inadvertently created. I powered up my computer and began pulling up files that I had been accumulating for months, without any clear plan for how to use them. When I first started acquiring commercial real estate around Pinewood Country Club, it had been purely a business decision. The properties were undervalued, the location was prime, and the potential for development was enormous. The fact that my purchases would give me leverage over Springfield's most exclusive social institution had been an interesting side benefit, nothing more. Now, as I reviewed the documents that outlined my ownership of virtually every commercial building within a 2-mile radius of the club, I began to see possibilities that went far beyond simple real estate investment. The lease agreement for the land under Pinewood Country Club's main building was a masterpiece of legal short-sightedness. Signed in 1953 when the original developers needed quick capital, it locked the club into a 70-year lease with remarkably unfavorable terms. The monthly payments had seemed reasonable at the time, but there were no inflation adjustments, no provisions for renegotiation, and most importantly, no automatic renewal clause. When the lease expired at midnight tomorrow, Pinewood Country Club would technically be trespassing on my property unless I chose to extend their agreement. And after tonight's display of character, I was feeling decidedly ungenerous about extending anything to people who had demonstrated such casual cruelty. My phone rang, interrupting my review of legal documents, and I saw James Miller's name on the caller ID. James had been my attorney since I started Chen Holdings, a brilliant legal mind who specialized in complex real estate transactions and had never once questioned my preference for anonymity. If anyone could help me navigate the delicate legal and public relations aspects of what I was contemplating, it would be him. "Emma," he said without preamble, "I just got a very interesting call from David Park at Pinewood Country Club. Apparently there was some kind of incident tonight involving you and several prominent members? You could call it an incident, I said carefully. Or you could call it a revelation about the character of Springfield's social elite. David seemed to be under the impression that you might be considering some kind of legal action against the club. He was quite anxious to discuss potential settlement options. The speed with which David Park had contacted James told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the club's management was taking tonight's events. They weren't treating this as a simple social misunderstanding that would blow over in a few days. They were preparing for war. James, what would happen if I chose not to renew Pinewood's lease tomorrow? The silence that followed was so long that I began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When James finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a lawyer who had just realized his client was contemplating something unprecedented. Technically, they would have 30 days to vacate the premises unless you granted them an extension. But Emma, we're talking about a 70-year-old institution with over 300 members, most of whom are among the wealthiest and most politically connected people in the state. I'm aware of their connections. Are you also aware that forcing them out would likely result in the most contentious legal battles Springfield has ever seen? They'll claim you're acting in bad faith, that there was an implied understanding about renewal, that you're using your position to retaliate for personal grievances. And what would your professional assessment be of their chances of success with those arguments? Another pause, shorter this time, followed by the sound of papers rustling as James presumably reviewed the lease agreement. Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. The lease is ironclad, the terms are unambiguous, and you have no obligation to renew. But Emma, legal correctness and practical consequences are two very different things. These people have the resources to make your life extremely difficult even if they ultimately lose. James, do you remember why I hired you 5 years ago? Because you wanted someone who could handle complex transactions while maintaining absolute discretion about your identity and your business strategies. And have I ever asked you to do anything unethical or illegal in service of those strategies? Never. Then trust me when I tell you that what I'm contemplating now isn't about revenge or retaliation. It's about accountability. The people who humiliated me tonight didn't just insult a random stranger who wandered into their event. They revealed their fundamental character, their belief that wealth gives them the right to diminish and dismiss anyone they perceive as inferior. I could hear James typing on his computer, probably pulling up news articles and social media posts about the evening's events. The story was probably already spreading through Springfield's social networks, though I doubted the initial versions would accurately reflect what had actually happened. Emma, I understand your anger, and frankly, from what David Park described, their behavior was inexcusable. But there are other ways to address this that don't involve nuclear options, such as public apologies, charitable donations in your name, policy changes at the club to prevent similar incidents. David mentioned that they would be willing to discuss membership offers, board positions, whatever it would take to resolve this amicably. The offer was exactly what I had expected, and exactly what confirmed that these people still didn't understand the fundamental nature of their mistake. They thought this was about me wanting access to their exclusive world, about my hurt feelings over being excluded from their social circle. They couldn't conceive that someone might find their world not just unappetizing but actively repulsive. James, I want you to send David Park a formal notice that Pinewood Country Club's lease will not be renewed. The notice should be delivered first thing tomorrow morning, giving them the minimum required 30 days to vacate the premises. Emma, please take some time to think about this. Once we send that notice, there's no going back. The legal and public relations battle will consume months of your life, and even if you win, the cost will be enormous. The cost of doing nothing would be even higher. These people need to understand that their behavior has consequences, that their wealth and social position don't protect them from accountability. And if they make you a public enemy in the process, if they use their media connections and political influence to destroy your reputation and your business. I considered his question carefully, weighing the risks against the potential benefits of forcing a reckoning with people who had operated without meaningful challenge for decades. James, my business is successful because I understand value, because I make smart investments, and because I treat people with respect regardless of their social status or economic position. None of that will change regardless of what Pinewood's members say about me in their social circles or their media outlets. But your anonymity will be gone forever. Once this becomes public, you'll be the most famous businesswoman in Springfield, and everything you do will be scrutinized and criticized. Maybe it's time for that to change. Maybe I've been hiding in the shadows too long, letting people like Richard and Victoria Blackwood shape this city's culture while I focused on building wealth instead of using it responsibly. James sighed with the resignation of someone who had learned to recognize when his client had made an irreversible decision. All right, I'll draft the notice tonight and have it delivered tomorrow morning. But Emma, I want you to prepare for the fact that this is going to get very ugly very quickly. I'm counting on it. After ending the call with James, I spent the next several hours researching every member of Pinewood Country Club's board of directors, every major donor to their charitable events, and every business relationship that connected the club to the broader Springfield community. What I discovered was a web of interconnected wealth and influence that extended far beyond the golf course and dining rooms where they conducted their social activities. Richard Blackwood's real estate development company had received preferential treatment on several major city contracts over the past decade, despite submitting bids that weren't always the lowest or most competitive. His wife Victoria served on the boards of 3 major charitable organizations, using her position to steer donations toward causes that benefited their social circle, while neglecting issues that affected Springfield's working-class population. Michael Hayes, the board member whose family had belonged to Pinewood for 3 generations, owned a construction company that had somehow managed to avoid the safety violations and environmental citations that plagued his competitors. His wife Amanda was the driving force behind the city's Historic Preservation Committee, which had repeatedly blocked affordable housing developments while fast-tracking projects that enhanced property values in wealthy neighborhoods. The pattern was clear and depressingly predictable. These people had spent decades using their wealth and social connections to rig the system in their favor, creating advantages for themselves while maintaining barriers for anyone who might challenge their dominance. Tonight's display of casual cruelty wasn't an aberration. It was simply the most visible expression of attitudes that infected their entire approach to life. But what they had failed to consider, in their arrogance and assumption of perpetual dominance, was that someone with greater resources and sharper strategic thinking might eventually take an interest in their activities. They had become complacent, convinced that their wealth and social position made them untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. I opened a new file on my computer and began drafting what I privately thought of as the Pinewood Project. If I was going to challenge these people, if I was going to force them to confront the consequences of their behavior, I needed to do it systematically and comprehensively. Half measures would only give them opportunities to regroup and retaliate. The first phase would be the lease termination, which would create immediate crises and force them to reveal their true priorities. Would they attempt to negotiate in good faith, acknowledging their behavior and committing to meaningful change? Or would they resort to the bullying tactics and political pressure that had served them so well in the past? The second phase would depend entirely on their response to the first. If they chose to fight, I would systematically examine every business relationship, every city contract, every charitable organization that had benefited from their influence. James was right that they had the resources to make my life difficult, but I had the resources to make their lives impossible. The third phase, if it became necessary, would involve using my real estate holdings to reshape Springfield's entire social and economic landscape. I owned enough commercial property to influence where businesses chose to locate, where people chose to shop, and where social events could realistically be held. If Pinewood's members wanted to play hardball, I could show them what real power looked like. My phone buzzed with a text message from Grace, who had apparently spent her evening doing research of her own. Emma, I've been reading about Chen Holdings online. You own 47 commercial properties worth over $60 million. Why didn't you ever tell me you were one of the wealthiest people in the state? I stared at her message for a long moment, considering how to explain something I had never fully articulated even to myself. The truth was that I had built my fortune specifically to avoid becoming the kind of person I had encountered at Pinewood tonight. Wealth was a tool, not an identity, and the moment I started defining myself by my bank account was the moment I would begin to lose the values that had guided my success. Because it's not who I am, I typed back. It's just what I happen to own. That's exactly what someone who grew up poor would say after becoming rich. She was right, of course. I had grown up in a working-class family, where my parents cleaned office buildings at night to pay for my college education. The memory of watching my mother scrub toilets in fancy office buildings while their wealthy occupants worked late had shaped my understanding of how the world really operated. Success was possible, but it required intelligence, determination, and a clear-eyed recognition that most systems were designed to benefit people who were already wealthy. Grace, can you do me a favor? Depends on what it is. I need you to contact every event planner, caterer, and vendor in Springfield. Tell them that Chen Holdings is looking to establish preferred relationships with service providers who share our commitment to treating all clients with respect and dignity. That's going to require some explanation. Most of these people don't know what Chen Holdings stands for beyond real estate investment. Then this will be a good opportunity to educate them. Let them know that we'll be hosting events that bring together people from all economic backgrounds, and we need partners who understand that worth isn't determined by someone's clothing or social connections. There was a long pause before Grace responded, and I could imagine her processing the implications of what I was asking her to do. Emma, you're planning to compete directly with Pinewood, aren't you? You're going to create an alternative social structure that makes their exclusivity irrelevant. I'm planning to create opportunities for connection and community that don't depend on humiliating people who don't meet arbitrary standards of wealth and status. And if they try to pressure vendors not to work with you, then we'll learn which businesses in Springfield prioritize integrity over intimidation. The conversation continued for another hour as Grace and I discussed the practical details of what would essentially be the creation of a parallel social infrastructure. It was ambitious, expensive, and guaranteed to generate enormous controversy, but it was also necessary. Pinewood Country Club and institutions like it had shaped Springfield's culture for too long, creating divisions and hierarchies that served no purpose beyond making wealthy people feel superior to their neighbors. By 3 a.m, I had drafted detailed plans for the first 6 months of what I was already thinking of as the Springfield Community Initiative. Unlike Pinewood's exclusive membership model, our events would be open to anyone who could afford modest ticket prices, with scholarships available for people who couldn't. Unlike their charity auctions that raised money for causes that served their interests, our fundraising would focus on issues that actually mattered to working families: affordable housing, educational opportunities, healthcare access. Most importantly, unlike their culture of casual cruelty toward people they perceived as inferior, our events would be spaces where treating others with dignity and respect was not just expected but actively celebrated. The implementation would require careful coordination and significant financial investment, but I had both the resources and the motivation to see it through. By the time Pinewood's members realized what was happening, their social monopoly would be broken permanently. James called at 7 a.m. to confirm that the lease termination notice had been delivered to David Park personally, along with copies to the club's board of directors and their legal counsel. The response had been swift and predictable. "They're requesting an emergency meeting," James reported. "David Park, Richard Blackwood, and their attorney want to sit down this afternoon to discuss renewal terms." "What did you tell them?" "That I would convey their request to you and provide a response by noon. Tell them I'll meet with them at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "Where?" I smiled, appreciating the opportunity for theater that their request had provided. "The conference room at Chen Holdings' downtown office." It's time they saw exactly what they're dealing with. The Chen Holdings building was a gleaming 15-story tower in the heart of Springfield's business district, with my private office occupying the entire top floor and conference facilities that had hosted some of the most significant business negotiations in the region's history. Unlike Pinewood's old-world elegance and traditional furnishings, my building represented modern efficiency and functional sophistication. More importantly, it was a space where I held every advantage, where the trappings of power served my interests rather than theirs. "Emma," James said carefully, "what outcome are you hoping for from this meeting?" "I'm hoping they'll reveal their character as completely in private as they did in public last night." "And then?" Then Springfield will finally understand exactly who has been shaping their community's values for the past 70 years. The morning passed quickly as I prepared for what I suspected would be the most important business meeting of my career. Not because of the financial stakes involved, though those were substantial, but because it would determine whether Springfield's future would be shaped by the kind of casual cruelty I had witnessed at Pinewood, or by the possibility of something better. By noon, news of the lease termination had begun spreading through Springfield's business community, and my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, city officials, and business leaders who wanted to understand what was happening. I let them all go to voicemail, preferring to let the story develop naturally, rather than trying to control the narrative before I had a complete understanding of how Pinewood intended to respond. At 1:30, I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a charcoal business suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries but looked understated enough to avoid being ostentatious. The goal wasn't to intimidate through display of wealth, but to command respect through competence and preparation. As I walked through the lobby of my building toward the elevator that would take me to the conference room, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning I had been the invisible owner of a successful real estate company, content to build wealth while avoiding the spotlight. Today I was about to engage in a confrontation that would likely define Springfield's social landscape for decades to come. The transformation wasn't something I had planned or even wanted, but the members of Pinewood Country Club had forced it through their own arrogance and cruelty. Now they would have to live with the consequences of awakening something they should have left alone. At exactly 2 o'clock, my assistant announced that the delegation from Pinewood Country Club had arrived and was waiting in Conference Room A. I gathered my files, took a deep breath, and prepared to discover whether these people were capable of learning from their mistakes or whether they would choose to dig themselves into an even deeper hole. Either way, the next hour would determine whether Springfield's future would be built on exclusion and cruelty or on something resembling actual community values. The real war was about to begin. Conference Room A occupied the northwest corner of the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of downtown Springfield and the rolling hills beyond. The space was designed to impress without being ostentatious, featuring a custom mahogany table that could seat 20 people, state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment, and original artwork from local artists whose careers I had quietly supported over the years. I arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, positioning myself at the head of the table where I could observe the entire room while maintaining visual contact with the expansive view behind me. The symbolism wasn't accidental. I wanted the Pinewood delegation to understand immediately that they were entering my domain, playing by my rules, operating under my timeline. The elevator chimed at precisely 2 o'clock, followed by the sound of expensive shoes clicking against marble floors as my assistant escorted the visitors toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, I watched David Park lead a procession that included Richard and Victoria Blackwood, an older man I didn't recognize who was probably their attorney, and surprisingly Michael Hayes, whose presence suggested they were taking this meeting more seriously than I had anticipated. "Miss Chen," David said as he entered the room, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone desperately trying to reset the tone of a relationship that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice." I gestured toward the chairs arranged along the opposite side of the table, noting how they instinctively clustered together as if physical proximity could somehow strengthen their negotiating position. The dynamic was already clear. They had come as supplicants seeking favor from someone whose power they were only beginning to understand. "Please, have a seat," I said, remaining standing until they had settled themselves. The extra height gave me a psychological advantage, but more importantly, it allowed me to observe their body language and facial expressions as they took in the impressive surroundings and began to process the implications of meeting in my executive conference room rather than their familiar club environment. Richard Blackwood cleared his throat and attempted to establish himself as the spokesman for their group, straightening his tie with the nervous energy of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room who was beginning to suspect that wasn't the case here. "Miss Chen, I think we got off on the wrong foot last night," he began, his tone suggesting that he had rehearsed this opening during the ride from Pinewood to my office. "There were some unfortunate misunderstandings, And we'd like the opportunity to clear the air and discuss how we can move forward productively. Misunderstandings, I repeated, finally taking my seat and folding my hands on the table in front of me. That's an interesting way to characterize what happened. Could you be more specific about which aspects you found confusing? The question was designed to force him to either acknowledge their behavior directly or continue with euphemisms that would make their insincerity obvious to everyone in the room. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while David Park studied his hands as if they contained fascinating secrets. Well, Richard continued, his confidence wavering slightly under my direct gaze, I think the initial confusion about your connection to Chen Holdings led to some inappropriate assumptions about your presence at our event. Inappropriate assumptions, I said, letting the phrase hang in the air for a moment. Such as assuming I was there to steal food or provide cleaning services? The older man I didn't recognize leaned forward slightly, and I realized this must be their attorney, preparing to intervene if the conversation became too damaging to his client's legal position. Miss Chen, the attorney said smoothly, I'm Harold Pemberton, representing Pinewood Country Club's board of directors. While we certainly regret any confusion that may have occurred last evening, I think it would be more productive to focus on resolving the immediate issue of the lease renewal. And what immediate issue would that be, Mr. Pemberton? The notice of non-renewal that was delivered this morning. Surely we can discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial and allow the club to continue operating in its current location. I opened the file folder I had placed on the table and removed a copy of the original 1953 lease agreement, sliding it across the mahogany surface toward their side of the table. Have you had an opportunity to review the terms of the current lease? I asked. Harold Pemberton picked up the document and began scanning its contents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he absorbed the details of an agreement that had been signed when his clients were either children or not yet born. This is a very old contract, he said carefully. Circumstances have changed significantly since 1953. Surely there's room for negotiation based on the substantial improvements the club has made to the property over the decades. The improvements that were made with full knowledge that the lease would expire in 2023, I pointed out. The improvements that were built on land they never owned, under terms they agreed to voluntarily. Victoria Blackwood finally found her voice, though it carried none of the confident authority she had displayed the previous evening. Miss Chen, I think we all recognize that last night's events were regrettable. If there's something specific we can do to address your concerns, we're certainly open to discussion. My concerns, I said thoughtfully. Let me make sure I understand what you're offering. You're suggesting that you can somehow address the fact that your members feel entitled to humiliate people based on their appearance? That you can fix a culture that automatically assumes wealth equals worth and poverty equals inferiority? Michael Hayes spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice carrying the bluster of someone accustomed to intimidating people through family connections and inherited status. Now see here, Miss Chen, I think you're blowing this whole situation out of proportion. Pinewood has been a pillar of the Springfield community for 70 years. We've raised millions for charity, supported local businesses, and provided a gathering place for the city's civic leaders. A gathering place for civic leaders, I repeated. How fascinating. And which civic leaders would those be? The question seemed to confuse him, as if the answer should be obvious to anyone with basic knowledge of Springfield's power structure. Well, the mayor, several city council members, the Chamber of Commerce president, heads of major corporations. People who make important decisions that affect the entire community. I see. And these important decision makers, do they base their civic choices on the same criteria they use to determine who belongs at your social events? Clothing quality, perhaps? Social connections? Family background? Harold Pemberton was clearly recognizing the trap that his clients were walking into, but Michael Hayes seemed oblivious to the implications of what he was revealing about Pinewood's role in Springfield's governance. That's not how it works, he protested. Business gets discussed naturally when successful people gather together. It's about building relationships and trust. Trust based on what criteria? Based on knowing people, understanding their character, their commitment to the community. Their commitment to the community, I said slowly. Like the commitment you demonstrated last night when you assumed I was there to steal food? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of recognition. Even Michael Hayes seemed to understand that he had just connected Pinewood's influence over Springfield's civic affairs to the same prejudices and assumptions that had led to their current predicament. David Park attempted to redirect the conversation toward more practical matters, his face flushed with the embarrassment of someone watching his employers systematically destroy their own negotiating position. Miss Chen, regardless of last night's events, the fact remains that Pinewood employs over 60 people, hosts events that bring thousands of visitors to Springfield annually, and contributes significantly to the local economy. Forcing us to relocate would harm many people who had nothing to do with any misunderstandings. It was a reasonable argument, and probably the strongest point they could make, but it also revealed their continued failure to understand the nature of my objections to their behavior. Mr. Park, you're absolutely right that Pinewood's closure would affect many innocent people. The question is whether the club's board is willing to make the changes necessary to ensure that those people can keep their jobs. What kind of changes? Richard Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. I reached into my file folder again and removed a document I had spent most of the morning preparing, sliding copies across the table to each member of their delegation. A comprehensive restructuring of Pinewood's membership policies, governance structure, and cultural practices, I said as they began reading. Starting with the elimination of discriminatory membership criteria and the implementation of diversity requirements for the board of directors. Harold Pemberton's eyebrows rose as he absorbed the details of what I was proposing, while Victoria Blackwood's face went progressively paler as she realized the scope of the changes I was demanding. This would fundamentally alter the character of the club, she said weakly. Yes, it would. It would transform Pinewood from an exclusive enclave for wealthy people to a genuine community institution that serves all of Springfield's residents. But that's not what our members want, Michael Hayes protested. People join Pinewood precisely because it's exclusive, because it maintains certain standards. And what standards are those, Mr. Hayes? The standard that allows your members to mock strangers based on their clothing? The standard that assumes economic status determines human worth? The standard that treats service workers as invisible? Richard Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from conciliatory to calculating, as he began to understand that negotiation might not be possible. Miss Chen, I think we need to be realistic about what you're asking. You're essentially demanding that we destroy everything that makes Pinewood attractive to its current membership. I'm demanding that you create something better, something that builds community instead of dividing it, something that brings people together instead of keeping them apart. And if we refuse? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized we had reached the moment where diplomacy would either prevail or fail completely. Their response to my proposal would determine whether this meeting ended with an agreement or with the beginning of a much larger conflict. If you refuse, I said calmly, then you have 30 days to vacate the premises. Harold Pemberton set down the proposal and leaned forward with the aggressive confidence of someone preparing to play what he believed was his strongest card. Miss Chen, I think you may be underestimating the legal and practical complexities of what you're proposing. Pinewood Country Club has significant resources and considerable influence in this community. If you force us into a confrontational position, we'll have no choice but to protect our interests through every available means, such as legal challenges to the lease termination, public relations campaigns highlighting the economic damage your actions would cause, pressure on city officials to intervene in the dispute. We have relationships throughout Springfield's business and political communities. I'm sure you do, I said, reaching for my phone. Would you like to test the strength of those relationships? Before he could respond, I dialed a number and activated the speakerphone so everyone in the room could hear the conversation. Mayor Hartwell's office, came the crisp voice of a secretary. This is Emma Chen. Is the mayor available for a brief call? One moment, Miss Chen. The wait was brief, followed by the familiar voice of Springfield's mayor, a practical politician who had built his career on understanding where real power resided in the community. Emma, good to hear from you. I've been getting some interesting calls about a situation involving Pinewood Country Club. Anything I should know about? Actually, Mayor, I have some representatives from Pinewood here in my conference room, and they seem to believe that political pressure might influence my business decisions regarding their lease renewal. I thought you might want to clarify the city's position on private property rights. The pause that followed was long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly where the mayor's loyalties lay when faced with a choice between Pinewood's social influence and Chen Holdings' economic power. Well, Emma, as you know, the city has always respected property owners' rights to make decisions about their assets according to their own business judgment. While we certainly value all the organizations that contribute to Springfield's community life, we wouldn't presume to interfere in private contractual matters. I appreciate that clarification, Mayor. I'll let my guests know that they shouldn't expect political intervention in this dispute. Always happy to help, Emma. Give my regards to your father. I ended the call and looked across the table at 5 faces that had gone various shades of pale as they processed what they had just witnessed. Harold Pemberton was staring at the phone as if it had personally betrayed him, while Richard Blackwood appeared to be recalculating everything he thought he knew about Springfield's power structure. That was illuminating, I said mildly. Would you like to test any other relationships? Victoria Blackwood found her voice first, though it carried none of its previous authority. Miss Chen, I think we may have misunderstood the scope of your influence in the community. My influence comes from treating people with respect and contributing to causes that actually matter, rather than using social connections to maintain artificial hierarchies. But surely, Michael Hayes said desperately, you can't seriously intend to destroy a 70-year institution over a single evening's misunderstanding. Mr. Hayes, let me ask you something. In your opinion, was last night's behavior unusual for Pinewood's members, or was it fairly typical of how you treat people you perceive as inferior? The question forced him into an impossible position. If he claimed their behavior was unusual, he would be admitting that the club's members were capable of extraordinary cruelty when they thought no one important was watching. If he admitted it was typical, he would be confirming that Pinewood's culture was fundamentally toxic. I think, he said carefully, that sometimes social situations can bring out competitive instincts that don't necessarily reflect people's true character. Competitive instincts, I repeated. Is that what you call it when grown adults mock a stranger's clothing and suggest she's there to steal food? David Park had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the conversation, clearly recognizing that his employers were systematically destroying any chance of reaching an agreement. Miss Chen, he interjected, what would it take for you to consider renewal? I mean, realistically, what specific changes would need to happen? I picked up the proposal they had been reading and flipped to the final page, where I had outlined my non-negotiable requirements. Complete elimination of membership fees above $500 annually, with scholarships available for anyone who can't afford that amount. Open events at least twice monthly that welcome the entire Springfield community. Board of directors elected by the full membership rather than appointed by current board members. And most importantly, mandatory training for all staff and members on treating people with dignity regardless of their economic status or social background. The list was comprehensive, and from their perspective, probably devastating. It would transform Pinewood from an exclusive club for wealthy families into something resembling an actual community center. Those changes would bankrupt the club, Richard Blackwood said flatly. Our operating expenses require the current membership fee structure. Then perhaps you need to reconsider your operating expenses, I suggested. Do you really need crystal chandeliers and imported wine when local families can't afford basic health care? That's not how private clubs work, Victoria protested. People pay premium prices for premium experiences. And what makes an experience premium? The quality of the service? The beauty of the facilities? Or the knowledge that you're surrounded by people who share your prejudices against anyone different from yourselves? Harold Pemberton was studying the proposal with the expression of someone trying to find loopholes in a contract written by someone smarter than himself. Finally, he looked up with the resignation of someone delivering news he didn't want to share. Miss Chen, while I admire your social vision, I have to advise my clients that accepting these terms would essentially mean dissolving Pinewood Country Club and creating something entirely different in its place. Yes, it would. It would mean creating something better. But it wouldn't be what our members joined, Michael Hayes said. It wouldn't provide the exclusivity and prestige that they value. And that's exactly the problem, I said, standing up and walking to the windows that overlooked downtown Springfield. Your members value exclusivity and prestige, more than human decency. They value their ability to feel superior to others, more than they value being part of a genuine community. From the 14th floor, Springfield spread out below us like a detailed map, with buildings and neighborhoods clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight. I could see the Pinewood Country Club's roof in the distance, surrounded by the commercial properties I had been systematically acquiring over the past several years. "Mr. Pemberton," I said without turning away from the window, "you mentioned that Pinewood has significant resources to fight this decision. I'm curious about your assessment of those resources." "Well, the club has considerable assets, legal representation, and, as I mentioned, relationships throughout the business and political communities." "And you believe those advantages would be sufficient to overcome my position?" "I believe they would make any legal challenge extremely expensive and time-consuming for both parties." I smiled and gestured toward the view outside the conference room windows. "Would you mind joining me here for a moment? All of you?" They exchanged uncertain glances but rose from their chairs and approached the windows, clustering together as they had when they first entered the room. I pointed toward a gleaming office tower about 6 blocks away. "That building houses Springfield's 3 largest law firms. I own it." "The parking garage where you probably left your cars? I own that too. The restaurant where you likely had lunch before coming here? I own the building it's in." I moved my finger to indicate another cluster of buildings. "The shopping center where your wives buy their designer clothes? Mine." "The office complex where Michael's construction company rents space? Also mine." "The bank building where you keep your accounts? I don't own that one, but I own the land it sits on." The silence in the room was profound as they began to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. I had spent 5 years quietly assembling a real estate empire that touched virtually every aspect of Springfield's commercial life, and they were only now beginning to grasp the implications. "In fact," I continued, "if you look carefully at the downtown area, you'll notice that I own approximately 60% of the commercial real estate within a 2-mile radius of where we're standing. Including, of course, the land under Pinewood Country Club." Richard Blackwood's face had gone completely white. "You're saying you own most of downtown Springfield?" "Yes." "The question you should be asking yourselves is whether you really want to start a war with someone who controls that much of your community's economic infrastructure." Victoria Blackwood sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "This is impossible," she whispered. You can't own everything." "I don't own everything," I corrected. "I own enough to ensure that businesses and organizations that share my values have places to operate, while those that don't might find their options more limited." Harold Pemberton was frantically calculating the implications of what I had just revealed his legal mind, working through scenarios that probably kept him awake at night. "Miss Chen, if you're suggesting that you would use your property holdings to retaliate against Pinewood's members personally—" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table. "I'm simply helping you understand the full context of the decision you're making. When you choose to fight someone, it's important to know exactly what resources they bring to the conflict." David Park was staring out the window with the expression of someone watching his career collapse in real time. "Miss Chen, if Pinewood loses its lease, the club will have to close permanently. We'll never find another location that offers the same prestige and amenities." "That's very likely true," I agreed, "unless, of course, you decide to accept my proposal and transform Pinewood into something the entire Springfield community can be proud of." "But our current members will never accept those changes," Michael Hayes protested. "They'll resign their memberships and demand refunds." "Then perhaps they were never the kind of members you should have wanted in the first place." The meeting had reached its climax, the moment where they would either recognize the magnitude of their mistake and commit to meaningful change, or double down on their prejudices and face the consequences. Richard Blackwood looked around the table at his fellow board members, reading the defeat in their faces and the resignation in their postures. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow sound of someone acknowledging a devastating loss. "Miss Chen, I think we need some time to discuss your proposal with the full board and our membership." "Of course," I said graciously. You have 28 days remaining on your lease. That should be sufficient time to make your decision. And if we can't reach a consensus, then you'll need to find somewhere else to hold your social events. Though I should mention that most of the venues suitable for large gatherings in Springfield are located in buildings I own. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If they chose to fight, I wouldn't just evict them from their current location. I would make it extremely difficult for them to establish themselves anywhere else in the city. Harold Pemberton gathered his papers with the mechanical movements of someone going through familiar motions, while his mind processed unfamiliar realities. Miss Chen, this has been educational. We'll be in touch. As they filed out of the conference room, their earlier confidence replaced by the subdued posture of people who had just learned they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely outclassed, I remained at the window watching Springfield's skyline and contemplating the changes that were about to reshape the city's social landscape. Their shock had been everything I had hoped for and more. The revelation that the woman they had mocked as poor actually controlled a significant portion of Springfield's commercial real estate had transformed their understanding of power, wealth, and influence in ways they were still processing. But more importantly, they now understood that their behavior had consequences, that their casual cruelty toward people they perceived as inferior would not be tolerated by someone with the resources to hold them accountable. The war for Springfield's soul was about to begin, and I had just demonstrated exactly why they should surrender while they still had the chance. The 24 hours following the Pinewood delegation's departure from my conference room unfolded with the relentless efficiency of dominoes falling in a carefully arranged pattern. Word of their humiliation spread through Springfield's social circles with the speed that only truly devastating gossip could achieve, carrying with it implications that rippled far beyond the immediate participants in our confrontation. My assistant fielded over 200 phone calls by noon the next day, with reporters, business leaders, and curious citizens all desperate to understand what had really happened between Emma Chen and Pinewood Country Club. The story had apparently evolved through multiple retellings, growing more dramatic with each iteration until some versions suggested I had personally escorted the board members from my building in handcuffs. The truth, as I learned from Grace's morning briefing, was somehow both more and less dramatic than the rumors suggested. The business community was buzzing with speculation about my real estate holdings, with several investigative journalists attempting to piece together the full scope of Chen Holdings' property acquisitions. Meanwhile, Pinewood's members were reportedly in a state of panic, with emergency board meetings called and heated debates erupting in their dining rooms about how to respond to what they were calling, quote, the Chen situation. Emma, Grace said as she settled into the chair across from my desk with a stack of newspaper clippings and printed internet articles, you've basically become the most famous person in Springfield overnight. The Business Journal wants an exclusive interview, the city paper is running a series on hidden real estate empires, and someone started a social media petition demanding that you force Pinewood to open their membership to everyone. I reviewed the headlines she had collected, noting how the story was being framed by different publications according to their audiences and perspectives. The business-focused outlets treated it as a fascinating case study in strategic property acquisition and corporate leverage. The general interest newspapers emphasized the David versus Goliath angle of a seemingly poor woman revealing herself to be incredibly wealthy. The social justice bloggers were celebrating what they saw as a long-overdue challenge to Springfield's entrenched class system. What's the reaction been from other property owners downtown? I asked, recognizing that my revelation about owning 60% of the commercial district would have significant implications for every business operating in those buildings. Mixed, but mostly positive, Grace reported. Several business owners have called to express support for your position, particularly the smaller retailers who felt pressure from Pinewood's informal boycotts over the years. Apparently, the club has a history of discouraging members from patronizing businesses they consider inappropriate. The information confirmed what I had suspected about Pinewood's role in shaping Springfield's economic landscape. Their influence extended far beyond their social events, reaching into decisions about where people shopped, dined, and conducted business. Breaking their monopoly on social status would have cascading effects throughout the entire community. Have we heard anything from the Pinewood board since yesterday's meeting? Harold Pemberton called twice this morning requesting additional time to review your proposal. He seems to think that 30 days isn't sufficient for the kind of organizational changes you're demanding. I smiled at the attorney's transparent attempt to buy time while they developed a strategy for fighting back. 30 days was more than sufficient to decide whether they wanted to embrace change or face dissolution, but admitting that would require acknowledging the weakness of their position. What did you tell him? That the lease expiration date isn't negotiable, but they're welcome to submit a counterproposal if they have specific concerns about implementation timelines. My phone rang displaying James Miller's number, and I activated the speakerphone so Grace could participate in the conversation. Emma, James said without preamble. I've been fielding calls all morning from attorneys representing various Pinewood members. They're exploring every possible legal avenue to challenge the lease termination, from breach of contract claims to accusations of discriminatory business practices. Discriminatory business practices, I asked, genuinely curious about their legal theory. They're arguing that you're using your property holdings to target them specifically because of their social and economic status, which they claim constitutes illegal discrimination against a protected class. Grace snorted with laughter at the absurdity of wealthy people claiming protected status, but I found the legal strategy fascinating in its complete inversion of reality. James, in your professional opinion, how likely are they to succeed with that argument? About as likely as a snowball surviving in hell, he said bluntly. Wealth isn't a protected class under any discrimination statute I'm aware of, and property owners have broad discretion in making rental and BDAS lease decisions. But the more interesting development is that several city council members received calls this morning from Pinewood members requesting emergency hearings about your property acquisitions. On what grounds? They're claiming that your concentration of commercial real estate ownership constitutes a monopoly that threatens the city's economic diversity and competitive business environment. The irony was breathtaking. An organization that had spent 70 years maintaining artificial monopolies on social status and community influence was now claiming to be concerned about economic competition. Have any council members agreed to hold hearings? 2 have expressed interest, but 3 others have already indicated they see this as a private contractual dispute that doesn't require government intervention. The mayor's office issued a statement this morning reaffirming the city's commitment to property rights and free market principles. Grace was taking notes as James spoke, her expression reflecting the same mixture of amusement and satisfaction I was feeling as we watched Pinewood's influence crumble in real time. James, I want you to prepare a comprehensive legal filing documenting every instance of discriminatory behavior by Pinewood members that we can verify. If they want to claim they're victims of discrimination, let's give the court a clear picture of their own track record. How far back should I research? Start with last week and work backwards until you get bored. I suspect there's a rich history of documented prejudice that will make their current claims look ridiculous. After ending the call with James, I spent the morning reviewing reports from my property managers about tenant reactions to the revelation of my ownership. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several business owners expressing relief that their landlord was someone who understood the challenges facing small enterprises, rather than an anonymous corporate entity focused solely on profit maximization. More significantly, 3 different restaurant owners had already contacted my office requesting information about hosting large events that would welcome diverse audiences. The demand for alternatives to Pinewood's exclusive gatherings was apparently much stronger than I had realized, with business leaders and community organizations eager for venues that didn't require social pedigree for admission. Grace, I said as she finished reading the latest batch of messages, I want you to start coordinating with these restaurant and event space inquiries. Let's see if we can create a comprehensive alternative to Pinewood's social calendar within the next month. What kind of events are you thinking about? Community mixers that bring together people from different economic backgrounds. Charity fundraisers that actually benefit working families instead of vanity projects. Business networking events that welcome entrepreneurs regardless of their family connections or educational credentials. The vision was ambitious but achievable, especially given the resources at my disposal and the apparent hunger for more inclusive social opportunities. If Pinewood's members valued exclusivity above human decency, Springfield would discover that genuine community was more rewarding than artificial superiority. My computer chimed with an urgent email from Detective Maria Rodriguez, a contact I had developed through my charitable work with domestic violence shelters. Her message was brief but intriguing. "Emma, need to speak with you about Pinewood Country Club. Can you call me this afternoon?" I dialed her number immediately, curious about what connection a police detective might have to Springfield's most exclusive social institution. "Emma, thanks for calling," Maria said. "I've been following the news about your situation with Pinewood, and I think you should know that their members have contacted several city officials demanding a police investigation into your business practices." "A police investigation? On what grounds?" "They're claiming that your property acquisitions might constitute criminal conspiracy or racketeering, since you apparently acquired so much real estate without public disclosure of your identity." The accusation was so absurd that I initially thought Maria might be joking, but her tone suggested she was completely serious about the complaint. "Maria, is there actually any legal requirement for property owners to publicly disclose their identities when making purchases?" "None whatsoever, as long as the transactions themselves are legal and properly documented, which yours clearly are, since I checked with the county records office this morning." "Then why are you calling me about this?" "Because I thought you should know that several prominent citizens are actively trying to use law enforcement resources to intimidate you for exercising your legal property rights. And because I wanted to offer my support if you need assistance dealing with any escalation of their campaign." The offer was both touching and strategically valuable. Having a respected police detective publicly supporting my position would make it much more difficult for Pinewood's members to portray me as some kind of criminal mastermind threatening Springfield's social order. "Maria, I appreciate the heads up and the offer of support. Is there anything specific I should be concerned about?" "Just be aware that they're not limiting their efforts to legal channels. I've heard rumors about plans to pressure your business tenants, organize boycotts of your properties, and possibly even target your personal reputation through social media campaigns." The escalation was predictable but disappointing. Rather than accepting responsibility for their behavior and working toward meaningful change, Pinewood's members were choosing to attack me personally while portraying themselves as victims of discrimination. "Have you learned anything specific about their strategy?" "Richard Blackwood apparently held a meeting at his house last night with about 20 other members. According to my source, they're planning what they're calling a, quote, comprehensive response to what they see as your attempt to destroy their way of life." "Their way of life," I repeated, fascinated by their ability to frame casual cruelty as a cultural tradition worth preserving. "Emma, these people have never faced real consequences for their behavior before. They're used to solving problems through social pressure, financial manipulation, and political influence. When those tools don't work, they tend to get desperate and unpredictable." The warning was valuable, but it also confirmed that my strategy was working exactly as intended. By demonstrating that their traditional sources of power were ineffective against someone with greater resources and clearer moral purpose, I was forcing them to reveal their true character in increasingly public ways. "Maria, would you be willing to document their attempts to misuse police resources for personal retaliation? I think the public should understand how these pillars of the community respond when they don't get their way." "Already on it. I've been keeping detailed records of every contact they've made with city officials, and I'm prepared to testify about their abuse of the system if necessary." The afternoon brought a parade of unexpected visitors to my office, each representing different aspects of Springfield's response to the growing controversy. A delegation from the Springfield Business Association wanted to understand my plans for the commercial properties I owned and whether my dispute with Pinewood would affect their operations. A group of community activists hoped to coordinate their efforts with mine to address broader issues of social inequality. Several journalists requested interviews about my background and my vision for Springfield's future. Most significantly, a representative from the Springfield Homeless Shelter arrived with a proposal that demonstrated exactly why Pinewood's charitable efforts had always felt so hollow and self-serving. "Ms. Chen," said Sarah Williams, the shelter's executive director, "we've been following the news about your confrontation with Pinewood Country Club, and we wanted you to know how much we appreciate your support over the years." "Your support has made the difference between survival and growth for our programs," I replied. "What can I do for you now?" We'd like to propose a partnership that would demonstrate the kind of community engagement that's been missing from Springfield's social institutions. Instead of charity auctions where wealthy people congratulate themselves for donating money they'll never miss, what if we created events where community members actually work together to address problems? The proposal was exactly what I had been hoping someone would suggest. Genuine community building that brought people together across economic lines to accomplish shared goals, rather than reinforcing social divisions through performative generosity. What did you have in mind? Monthly community service projects where business leaders work alongside homeless individuals to improve neighborhood conditions. Educational programs where successful entrepreneurs mentor young people from low-income families. Social events where financial status is irrelevant because everyone contributes according to their abilities. The vision aligned perfectly with my plans for transforming Springfield's social landscape. And Sarah's passion for authentic community engagement was exactly the kind of leadership the city needed. Sarah, I'd like to fund a comprehensive community center that could host these programs year-round. Something that would make Pinewood's facilities look outdated and irrelevant by comparison. Her eyes widened as she absorbed the implications of what I was offering. A community center? How comprehensive are we talking about? Full kitchen facilities for community meals, meeting rooms for educational programs, recreational spaces for families, business incubation areas for entrepreneurs, childcare facilities for working parents. Everything Springfield needs to build genuine community instead of artificial hierarchy. The conversation continued for over an hour as we outlined plans that would fundamentally reshape how Springfield's residents interacted with each other and addressed community challenges. By the time Sarah left my office, we had agreed on a timeline that would open the new community center within 6 months, funded entirely through Chen Holdings, and operated according to principles that prioritized inclusion, dignity, and mutual support. As evening approached, Grace updated me on the latest developments in what the local media had begun calling the Pinewood crisis. The club's membership was reportedly in revolt, with some members demanding that the board accept my terms while others insisted on fighting regardless of the consequences. 3 major donors had withdrawn their pledges for upcoming charity events, citing concerns about the organization's values and leadership. Most tellingly, David Park had submitted his resignation as club manager, stating in his letter that he could no longer work for an organization that he felt had lost its moral compass. His departure was being reported as the first significant defection from Pinewood's staff, but I suspected it wouldn't be the last. "Emma," Grace said as she prepared to leave for the day, "I think you should know that Victoria Blackwood called this afternoon requesting a private meeting. She claims she wants to discuss the situation without the other board members present." The request was intriguing but not surprising. Victoria had seemed more aware than her husband of the magnitude of their mistake, and she might be intelligent enough to recognize that continued confrontation would only lead to further humiliation. Did she say what she wanted to discuss? She claims she has information about internal discussions at Pinewood that you should know about, and she wants to explore whether there might be room for compromise. Schedule the meeting for tomorrow morning. But Grace, make sure security knows she's coming, and have someone document the conversation. You think she might try something? I think desperate people make unpredictable choices, and Victoria Blackwood is about to lose everything she spent her life building. That makes her dangerous. The evening news featured the Pinewood story as their lead segment, with reporters standing outside the club's main entrance interviewing members about their response to my ultimatum. The comments ranged from defiant to defeated, but what struck me most was how many people seemed genuinely shocked that their behavior toward me had been considered inappropriate. "I don't understand what the big deal is," said one elderly woman whose name I didn't recognize. "Private clubs have always had standards about dress codes and appropriate behavior. If someone shows up inappropriately dressed, naturally they're going to be questioned." Her inability to distinguish between dress codes and deliberate humiliation was exactly the problem I was trying to address. These people had convinced themselves that their prejudices were reasonable standards, that their cruelty was appropriate gatekeeping, that their exclusivity served some valid social purpose. The news segment also included man-on-the-street interviews with Springfield residents who weren't Pinewood members, and their responses revealed a community that was tired of being divided by artificial social hierarchies. "It's about time someone stood up to those people," said a small business owner whose shop was located in one of my buildings. They've been looking down on the rest of us for decades, while pretending to care about the community. I hope she shuts them down completely, added a young woman who identified herself as a teacher. Maybe then we can have social events in this city that don't make working people feel unwelcome. The public support was gratifying but also concerning. I hadn't intended to become a symbol of class warfare or social revolution. My goal was simply to hold specific people accountable for specific behavior while creating better alternatives for community engagement. But as I watched the news coverage and read the social media responses that Grace had compiled, I realized that the confrontation with Pinewood had tapped into much deeper frustrations about inequality, exclusion, and the abuse of social power. What had started as a response to personal humiliation was becoming a referendum on Springfield's entire social structure. My phone rang with a call from an unlisted number, and I answered cautiously, unsure what to expect. "Miss Chen, this is Margaret Foster," said a voice I didn't immediately recognize. "I'm Amanda Foster's daughter." The name clicked into place. Amanda Foster had been one of the Pinewood members who participated in mocking me at the charity event, laughing at my clothing and suggesting I didn't belong among their crowd. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" "I wanted to apologize for my mother's behavior, and to let you know that not everyone in our family agrees with how the club has been operating." The call was unexpected and touching, especially coming from someone who had no responsibility for her mother's choices, but felt compelled to distance herself from them. "Margaret, I appreciate you reaching out, but you don't need to apologize for your mother's behavior." "Actually, I do. I've been a member of Pinewood since I turned 18, and I've watched our generation inherit attitudes and practices that we should have questioned years ago. What happened to you was inexcusable, and the club's response since then has been even worse." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Margaret describing a growing divide between younger members who recognized the need for change and older members who saw any criticism as an attack on their fundamental values. "Miss Chen, I know this might sound presumptuous, but would you consider meeting with a group of younger members who want to support the reforms you've proposed? We think we might be able to help bridge the gap between what the club has been and what it could become." The offer was more promising than anything the official board had suggested, representing the possibility that meaningful change might be possible without completely destroying the institution. "Margaret, I'd be happy to meet with your group, but I want you to understand that the reforms I'm proposing aren't negotiable. This isn't about finding a compromise between discrimination and inclusion. It's about choosing which values will define your organization." I understand completely, and I think you'll find that more of our members are ready for that choice than the current board realizes. As I ended the call and prepared to leave my office, I reflected on how dramatically the situation had evolved in just 48 hours. What had begun as a humiliating encounter with Springfield's social elite had become a community-wide conversation about values, inclusion, and the responsibility that comes with wealth and influence. Pinewood Country Club was discovering that their traditional sources of power were ineffective against someone who combined greater resources with clearer moral purpose. Their attempts to use political pressure, legal intimidation, and social manipulation were backfiring spectacularly, turning them into symbols of everything Springfield was ready to reject. Tomorrow would bring Victoria Blackwood's private meeting, Margaret Foster's Reform Coalition, and continued fallout from a confrontation that was reshaping the entire community's understanding of power, privilege, and accountability. The war for Springfield's soul was far from over, but the battle lines were becoming increasingly clear, and I was confident about which side would ultimately prevail. The members of Pinewood Country Club had spent 70 years believing that wealth and social status made them untouchable. They were about to learn that their greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my financial resources, but underestimating the community's hunger for something better than the artificial hierarchy they had worked so hard to maintain. Their exclusive world was crumbling, and in its place, something genuinely inclusive was beginning to emerge. Victoria Blackwood arrived at my office precisely at 9 o'clock the following morning. But the woman who stepped out of the elevator bore little resemblance to the confident socialite who had mocked my appearance just days earlier. Her designer suit was perfectly pressed and her jewelry remained expensive, but her posture carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights confronting uncomfortable truths about herself and her world. "Miss Chen," she said as my assistant escorted her into the conference room, "thank you for agreeing to see me privately." I gestured toward the same chair she had occupied during the previous day's confrontation, noting how her eyes instinctively moved toward the windows that showcased my dominion over Springfield's commercial district. The view that had once symbolized my power now seemed to remind her of how completely her understanding of the city's hierarchy had been shattered. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Blackwood?" She opened her purse and withdrew a folder thick with documents, placing it on the table between us with the careful movements of someone handling explosive materials. "I need to show you something that the other board members don't know I have," she said, her voice carrying none of its previous authority. "Internal communications that reveal the full scope of how Pinewood has been operating behind the scenes." The folder contained printed emails, meeting minutes, and financial records that painted a disturbing picture of systematic discrimination that extended far beyond the casual cruelty I had personally experienced. Pinewood's board had apparently maintained detailed files on potential members, complete with background investigations that included everything from family ancestry to political affiliations to religious beliefs. "We called it our compatibility assessment," Victoria explained as I reviewed documents that would have been illegal if they had come from any organization covered by fair housing or employment laws. The idea was to ensure that new members would fit seamlessly into our existing community culture. The euphemisms were remarkable in their transparency. Compatibility meant racial homogeneity. Community culture meant economic exclusivity. Seamless integration meant ensuring that no one would challenge their prejudices or force them to examine their assumptions about human worth. "Mrs. Blackwood, why are you showing me this?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at documents that represented decades of institutionalized bigotry conducted under the banner of social refinement. "Because I realized that what happened to you wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the inevitable result of a system we created to ensure that we never had to confront anyone who might make us question our beliefs about ourselves." The admission was more honest than anything I had expected from someone so deeply invested in maintaining Pinewood's status quo, and it suggested that the shock of our confrontation might have genuinely awakened something resembling self-awareness. "What do you want me to do with this information?" "I want you to use it to ensure that when Pinewood falls, it can't simply reconstitute itself somewhere else under a different name. These documents prove that our discrimination was systematic and intentional, not accidental or cultural." Victoria reached into her purse again and withdrew a second, smaller folder. "I'm also prepared to provide testimony about specific incidents where the club's influence was used to harm individuals and businesses that didn't meet our approval. Restaurant owners who were blacklisted for serving the wrong clientele. Charitable organizations that were denied funding because they served people we considered undesirable. Business owners who were excluded from opportunities because they lacked the right social connections." The scope of Pinewood's malevolent influence was staggering, reaching into virtually every aspect of Springfield's economic and social life. They hadn't been content to simply exclude people from their events. They had actively worked to limit opportunities and resources for anyone who failed to meet their arbitrary standards. "Mrs. Blackwood, I have to ask, why are you willing to destroy an organization you've spent decades building?" She looked out the window toward the distant roof of Pinewood Country Club, visible among the trees that had once seemed to protect it from outside scrutiny. "Because my daughter called me yesterday to tell me she was ashamed to be my child," she said quietly. "Because I realized that the legacy I thought I was preserving was actually something poisonous that I was passing on to the next generation." The conversation continued for another hour as Victoria detailed the full extent of Pinewood's corrupt practices and her willingness to cooperate with any investigation that might result from my actions. By the time she left my office, I had enough documentation to destroy not just the club, but potentially several of its most prominent members who had used their positions for personal enrichment at the community's expense. That afternoon brought Margaret Foster and her coalition of younger Pinewood members, a group of 12 people ranging in age from their early 20s to their 40s, who represented what Victoria had described as the organization's last hope for redemption. Unlike their parents and grandparents, these individuals seem genuinely committed to transformation rather than preservation of existing power structures. Miss Chen, Margaret said as she introduced her companions, we've spent the last 2 days reviewing your proposal and developing specific implementation plans that we think could work. The group had clearly done their homework, presenting detailed budgets for reducing membership fees, comprehensive outreach strategies for diversifying the member base, and structural reforms that would democratize the club's governance while maintaining its facilities and programs. We understand that these changes would fundamentally alter Pinewood's character, said David Kim, a young attorney whose parents had belonged to the club for 30 years. But we think that's exactly what needs to happen if the organization is going to survive and serve a useful purpose. Their proposal was thoughtful and comprehensive, addressing virtually every concern I had raised while acknowledging the practical challenges of implementing such sweeping reforms. More importantly, their presentation demonstrated genuine understanding of why change was necessary rather than grudging acceptance of defeat. What kind of support do you have from the existing membership? I asked. About 30% are actively supportive, Margaret replied. Another 20% would go along with changes if they felt they had no choice. The remaining 50% are violently opposed and would probably resign rather than accept the new structure. And you see that as a positive outcome? We see it as necessary surgery, said Jennifer Walsh, a teacher whose family had belonged to Pinewood for 2 generations. The people who would leave over these changes are exactly the people whose presence makes the club toxic to everyone else. The mathematics of their proposal were compelling. Even if half the current membership resigned, the dramatically reduced fees and community outreach would attract hundreds of new members who were currently excluded by economic and social barriers. The club would be larger, more diverse, and more financially stable while serving its stated mission of building community rather than dividing it. Miss Tak, quote, Chen, Margaret said as their presentation concluded, we know we can't undo the harm that's been done or erase the club's history of discrimination, but we'd like the opportunity to prove that Pinewood can become something better than what it's been. I studied the faces around the conference table, seeing genuine remorse for past mistakes and authentic commitment to meaningful change. These young people hadn't been responsible for creating Pinewood's toxic culture, but they were willing to take responsibility for transforming it. I'll give you 60 days to implement these reforms, I said finally. If your proposal is adopted by the membership and the changes are demonstrably underway, I'll consider a lease renewal under modified terms. The relief in the room was palpable, but I held up a hand to indicate I wasn't finished. However, if the existing board rejects your proposal or attempts to water down the reforms, the lease expires as scheduled, and Pinewood closes permanently. The group agreed to my terms with the urgency of people who understood they were negotiating their organization's last chance for survival. Over the following weeks, they would discover whether Springfield's social elite was capable of choosing redemption over dissolution. The announcement of our agreement sent shockwaves through both Pinewood's membership and Springfield's broader community. The prospect that the exclusive club might actually transform itself into something resembling a genuine community institution seemed to energize reform-minded residents while horrifying traditionalists who had built their identities around exclusion and superiority. Richard Blackwood's response was swift and predictable. Within 24 hours of learning about the 60-day extension, he called an emergency membership meeting to rally opposition to what he termed the complete surrender of everything Pinewood represents. The meeting, held in the club's main dining room where I had first been humiliated, reportedly devolved into shouting matches between members who supported Margaret's reform coalition and those who preferred to see the club destroyed rather than democratized. Several longtime members dramatically torn up their membership cards, while others pledged to fight the proposed changes through every available legal and social channel. Grace attended the meeting as an observer, having obtained temporary access through her event planning connections, and her report painted a picture of an organization tearing itself apart under the pressure of choosing between transformation and extinction. Emma, you should have seen it, she said during our debriefing the following morning. Richard Blackwood actually stood up and declared that he would rather see Pinewood burn to the ground than opened to, quote, every Tom, Dick, and Harry who thinks they deserve access to our facilities. The quote, which was promptly leaked to local media, became a perfect encapsulation of the mentality that had made reform necessary in the first place. Rather than welcoming the opportunity to serve a broader community purpose, Pinewood's old guard preferred destruction to inclusion. Meanwhile, construction began on the Springfield Community Center, a 50,000-square-foot facility that would offer everything Pinewood provided, and more, but with a mission focused on bringing people together, rather than keeping them apart. The building, located on a plot of land I owned adjacent to downtown's main commercial district, would feature meeting rooms, recreational facilities, event spaces, and educational programs designed to serve residents regardless of their economic status or social connections. Sarah Williams, who had accepted my offer to serve as the center's executive director, threw herself into planning with the enthusiasm of someone finally given resources to match her vision for authentic community building. "Emma, the response has been incredible," she reported during one of our weekly planning meetings. "We've already received over 300 inquiries about membership, and the programming committee has proposed everything from small business incubation to senior citizen services to youth mentorship programs." The contrast with Pinewood's exclusive model couldn't have been more stark. Where the country club sought to limit access and maintain artificial scarcity, the community center embraced abundance and inclusion. Where Pinewood's events were designed to reinforce social hierarchies, our programs would focus on breaking down barriers and building genuine connections between people from different backgrounds. As the 60-day deadline for Pinewood's transformation approached, the community watched with fascination to see whether Springfield's most exclusive institution would choose evolution or extinction. Margaret Foster's Reform Coalition had worked tirelessly to build support for their proposal, hosting information sessions, conducting surveys, and engaging in the kind of democratic process that had been completely foreign to Pinewood's traditional governance structure. The final membership vote was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 2 months after my initial confrontation with Richard Blackwood and his social circle. The outcome would determine not just Pinewood's fate, but Springfield's future direction as a community that either embraced inclusion or remained trapped by outdated hierarchies. I chose not to attend the vote, preferring to let the members make their decision without any pressure from the woman who had forced them to confront this choice. Instead, I spent the evening at the construction site of the community center, reviewing progress with the contractors and visualizing the programs and events that would soon bring Springfield's residents together in ways that had never been possible under Pinewood's exclusionary model. Margaret called at 9:30 with results that were closer than anyone had predicted. "Miss Chen, the reform proposal passed by exactly 7 votes," she said, her voice reflecting exhaustion and relief in equal measure. 143 in favor, 136 opposed. The narrow margin demonstrated how divided Pinewood's membership remained, but it also confirmed that enough people recognized the need for change to make transformation possible. "What happens next?" I asked. "Implementation begins immediately. We're restructuring the board, reducing membership fees, launching community outreach programs, and opening our facilities for public events starting in January." The victory was significant, but incomplete. Pinewood would survive, but its character would be so fundamentally altered that it would essentially become a different organization operating in the same location. "Margaret, I want you to know that I'll be watching closely to ensure that these changes are implemented fully and permanently. I wouldn't expect anything less. And Miss Chen, thank you for forcing us to become something better than what we were." The weeks following Pinewood's transformation vote brought a series of developments that reshaped Springfield's social landscape more dramatically than I had originally envisioned. Richard Blackwood and approximately 60 other members resigned en masse, loudly proclaiming their intention to establish a new private club that would maintain the exclusive standards they felt Pinewood had abandoned. Their effort lasted exactly 3 weeks before collapsing under the weight of practical realities they had never been forced to confront. Without access to prime real estate at below-market rates, without the infrastructure that 70 years of institutional development had created, and without the community goodwill that Pinewood had squandered through decades of discriminatory practices, their alternative organization attracted little interest and even less financial support. Meanwhile, Pinewood's transformation exceeded even the Reform Coalition's most optimistic projections. The reduced membership fees and community outreach programs attracted over 400 new members within the first month, creating a more diverse and energetic organization than had ever existed in the club's history. The Springfield Community Center opened in March to celebrations that brought together over 2,000 residents for a weekend of events that showcased exactly what authentic community building looked like. Unlike Pinewood's charity auctions, where wealthy people congratulated themselves for writing checks, our opening celebration featured collaborative service projects, interactive workshops, and social events where financial status was irrelevant because everyone contributed according to their abilities. Standing in the center's main hall, surrounded by families from every neighborhood in Springfield, small business owners networking with corporate executives, teenagers teaching senior citizens how to use smartphones, and children playing together regardless of their parents' economic circumstances, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction that went far beyond the personal vindication of my confrontation with Pinewood's board. This was what community looked like when it wasn't artificially constrained by prejudice and exclusion. This was what Springfield could become when people chose connection over competition, inclusion over isolation, shared purpose over social hierarchy. Grace found me near the windows that overlooked the community gardens, where volunteers were planting vegetables that would be donated to local food banks. "Emma, do you ever regret how all this started?" she asked, following my gaze toward families working together in the afternoon sunshine. I considered her question carefully, reflecting on the humiliation I had experienced at Pinewood and the chain of events it had triggered. "I regret that it took so long for someone to challenge a system that was harming our entire community," I said finally. "But I don't regret discovering that I had the power to create something better." A year later, Springfield had become a model for other communities struggling with similar issues of social division and economic inequality. The community center was operating at capacity, with waiting lists for most programs. Pinewood Country Club had evolved into a genuinely inclusive institution that served as a bridge between different economic and social groups, and downtown's business district was thriving under a more collaborative and community-focused approach to economic development. I maintained my office in the Chen Holdings building, but my role had evolved from invisible real estate investor to visible community leader who used wealth as a tool for building connections rather than maintaining divisions. The transformation hadn't been easy or universally welcomed, but it had demonstrated that change was possible when people with resources chose to use them responsibly. My assistant announced that Victoria Blackwood was requesting a meeting, and I agreed to see her, curious about how the past year had affected someone who had been so central to Pinewood's previous culture. She entered my office looking healthier and more relaxed than I had seen her since our first encounter, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found peace with difficult decisions. "Miss Chen, I wanted to thank you personally for forcing us to confront who we really were," she said as she settled into the chair across from my desk. "How are you adjusting to the new Pinewood?" "It's remarkable," she said with genuine enthusiasm. "I've met more interesting people in the past 6 months than I had in the previous 6 years. My daughter and I are actually planning events together instead of arguing about the club's values. For the first time in decades, I'm proud to be associated with the organization." Victoria had become one of Pinewood's most effective ambassadors for change, using her social connections to encourage other exclusive institutions throughout the region to examine their own practices and consider similar reforms. "Miss Chen, I hope you realize that what you accomplished here extends far beyond Springfield. Communities across the country are paying attention to our transformation and asking whether their own social institutions are serving community purposes or simply perpetuating division." The broader impact was gratifying but also somewhat overwhelming. I had never intended to become a symbol of social change or a model for community organizing. My goal had simply been to hold specific people accountable for specific behavior, while creating better alternatives for community engagement. But as I watched Victoria leave my office and return to her work building the kind of inclusive community that Pinewood was becoming, I understood that some confrontations create ripples that extend far beyond their original scope. The woman who had been mocked for her appearance at an exclusive social event had discovered that apparent weakness could be transformed into actual strength, that hidden resources could be leveraged for community benefit, and that the people who underestimate others often reveal more about their own limitations than their target's capabilities. Springfield's transformation, from a community divided by artificial hierarchies to one united by shared values, hadn't been easy or complete, but it had demonstrated that change was possible when people chose courage over comfort, inclusion over exclusion, and authentic community over manufactured superiority. Standing at my office window as evening fell over a city that had embraced the possibility of becoming something better than what it had been, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that humiliating encounter at Pinewood Country Club. The woman who had been dismissed as poor and unworthy had revealed herself to be neither, but more importantly, she had discovered that true wealth lay not in the buildings she owned, but in the community she had helped to create. The members of Pinewood Country Club had indeed been standing on property I owned, but they had also been standing on assumptions about power, privilege, and human worth that proved to be far less stable than the real estate beneath their feet. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.